So most Trump supporters say that they don't watch the news, and yet they parrot the same talking points. So how do people who proudly reject journalism claim to be the most informed? Welcome back to Political Critical Thinking. I'm Stephanie Beninati. Please like and subscribe. Today we're going to continue our talk on the Powell Memo and the blueprint for corporate control. So the Powell Memo was written by Lewis F. Powell Jr. in 1971 before being appointed to the Supreme Court by Nixon. We need to identify the four key components to the Powell Memo. The first one was to take over the universities. The second one was to take over the media. Think Fox News, Newsmax, etc. Take over politics, especially the courts. And finally, the federal government agencies. The goal? To protect corporate power by reshaping public opinion and manipulating the democratic systems. So how do we get from regulation to corporate media to where we are today, a monopoly? Well, before Reagan, most of the media was locally owned, and it had community accountability. So one of the things that Reagan did, I like to call Reagan our deregulator-in-chief. So our deregulator-in-chief, Reagan killed the fairness doctrine in 1987, opening the floodgates. Since then, mega corporations own nearly all the U.S. media. Right now, corporate-controlled outlets are acting neutral while they're pushing right-leaning narratives and silencing their critics. They always say that the government should be run as a business. But this is a privatization scam. This ideology is pushed by corporate media oligarchs, the right-leaning corporate like Fox News. So the government is supposed to serve the people, let's be clear, not shareholders. Privatization lowers transparency, which we're seeing today, less accountability, and focuses on profit, not the public interest. Is there any corporation that works for its employees? No, it works for itself, to enrich itself, and it works to enrich its stockholders. So that's exactly what authoritarian governments look like. When you try to replace a democratic government with a business model, what you're really saying is you want to replace a democracy with authoritarianism. And authoritarianism, by nature, are extremely corrupt. They are there to enrich themselves and the people around them, just like a business. And what I'd like you to think about is Donald Trump is a serial business failure. With all of his bankruptcies, he is the poster child for why you do not want to run a government like a business. Most businesses fail. That is statistically true. The goal for a business is to grow, is to be big. You don't want the government to grow and be big. You want smaller government. Democrats actually believe in smaller government, believe it or not. So for all of those who hate real journalism, think about what the right media has been pushing, whether you watch it or not. The narrative has been the elites are the problem, right? But who's really the elite? The right's billionaire hypocrisy is so deep that MAGA says they hate the elites, yet worship billionaires. Most GOP leaders were born wealthy and have been insulated from hardships. Meanwhile, the Democratic leaders, Biden, Harris, Obama, even the Clintons, largely come from working class families. They literally pulled themselves up from their bootstraps. And you can see that in their legislation. Their legislation is largely for the working people, for the people of America, to enrich their lives, while the right is all about enriching corporations. This isn't my opinion. This is simply going back and looking at legislation. Who does that legislation protect? And besides legislation, to prove my point, just look at what the right wing hates. They hate labor unions. They hate public education. They hate journalism. They hate the federal government. These are the four specific tenets that the Powell Memo talked about controlling in 1971. Which, by the way, in 1973, the Powell Memo gave birth to the Heritage Foundation and many other conservative think tanks. That's how powerful it was. And they spent the last 50 plus years implementing these things. And that is why when you look at the right wing, they hate all the things that the Powell Memo tells them that they need to control. They need to turn the public sentiment against these things. And the reason they want to turn people against these institutions is because these institutions protect you and me. And Republicans want to break them, discredit them, and sell them off to the highest bidder, which are generally their wealthy donors. So this I don't watch the news is not a flex. People boast about being uninformed as if it's a virtue. But understand, Republicans destroyed the trust in the media by using the media empire that they built and then filled that vacuum with rage bait YouTubers, radio cranks, and propaganda outlets. If you're only listening to people who affirm your biases, you're not informed, you're conditioned. And this conditioning has been happening for 50 plus years. So it's easy for somebody like Donald Trump to come in and take over in the way that he's taken over. It's easy for Americans who are uninformed abdicate and relinquish their control. The government is built by the people for the people, but they forget that because they're overwhelmed and overworked into a system that the Republicans have built for them to feel frustrated and angry and believe that nothing is working for them, that they are willing to relinquish the little bit of control that they still have to somebody like Donald Trump. So here's the thing. Nothing you say is ever going to penetrate a MAGA nut, okay? But we, as Democrats, we need to show up smarter. We need to understand the facts. We can't be having these same old arguments and debates. We need to understand where we came from and how we got here. Those are the conversations that we need to be having. When we can explain why they don't trust the media, and I'm talking to the people like third-party voters and non-voters, people who don't think that their vote matters. These are the people that we have to show up for. These are the people who are going to help us make a change. And maybe we can pull off 10 or 15% of MAGA nut, because maybe there's a group of people who just are so uninformed and don't care that they just vote for Trump because he's the loudest person in the room. Those are the people that, when given an opportunity, if they understand what's going on, may change their mind. But the MAGA nuts, they have been taught to not have empathy. And so they will not change until it affects them personally. When their kid grows up and is gay or trans, that's when it'll affect them, or when their finances are hit, but still, even though it affects them, and you see this in MAGA nuts who change, they still hate Democrats. Not to hate Democrats' policies, because they don't know the policies. When you try to talk policy with the MAGA nut, they have no idea what you're talking about. But they hate Democrats for deeper, more visceral reasons. And all of that is indoctrination and conditioning from the right. We need to talk plainly about how we got here. And we need to understand the GOP strategy. We need to talk strategy and not issues, because the issues don't matter. Not to MAGA nuts. They're in a cult of personality. What they are all about is feelings, right? Their anger and their outrage. They're not about actual policy and what helps them or helps the American people. When you can show people how over the last 100 years, these policies have affected them in a good way, that's where you're going to see change. When we're engaging with these people, if someone refuses to engage in real conversation with you, then just walk away. Then just don't go to dinner with them. Don't have relationships with them. Create boundaries for yourself until they're willing to come to the party. If somebody is not indoctrinated, if somebody is not in a cult, then they can sit down with you and have open conversations. I've had many open conversations with Trump supporters who are not in a cult. They just are uninformed. And they have been open and willing to have conversations with me about things. But if somebody is not willing to sit down and have a civil conversation with you about policies, not about personalities, then they are in a cult. And people who are in a cult are dangerous. So I would suggest that we put boundaries around them until that cult no longer has a hold on them. Usually people get out of cults when it's not fun anymore, when it's more painful to be in it than it is to be out of it. And right now, it's not painful for them to be in it if we're hanging out with them. If they're getting our company, if they're being invited over for dinner and drinks, it's not uncomfortable for them. So if you really care about this country and you really care about making a change, then we have to make it uncomfortable for them, because they will stay in that cult until being in it is more uncomfortable than getting out of it. Final call here. If you're not voting, if you're voting third party, you are part of the problem. And I say this respectfully because I understand how people get brainwashed. But we have got to understand that right now, Republicans are actively changing laws to suppress voters, especially females, young people, and people of color. Currently, the system isn't broken, but it's being broken. So it's very important to vote in every election, especially in your local elections. It's also very important to read the news, to understand the news, to consume the news. I actually subscribe to Ground News, and I'll put a link in the description. Ground News gives you all sorts of different perspectives, but it's a great place to start because you can look at, if it's right-leaning or left-leaning, and you can compare the difference. It's about elevating and educating yourself, and everybody should want to do that. But going back to voting, all over the country, they're changing the law. Understand what the laws are in your state. Understand what kind of ID that they're requiring, because they're changing that. And that's really going to affect women who just recently got married. So it's important to understand that journalists, they are the real watchdogs. Their work is fact-checked multiple times to survive libel laws. Right now, we're seeing what was considered mainstream responsible media pay out millions, if not billions of dollars to Trump because they're afraid of their mergers that are happening. They're afraid that the federal government will block them. They're more concerned about their corporate stocks than they are about the American people. And so that is why it's more important than ever to focus on local news and to focus on the truth and basic facts. And those facts can be found easily. They're not hard to find. We just have to know how to find them. But that's my point. Republicans are for the corporations and Democrats are for the people. And you can see it again in just looking at the legislation over the last 100 years. This is the battle that Democrats were dealing with right now. It's going to be information versus indoctrination. That is why Democrats and pro-democracy people who are out there fighting the good fight, we need to get smarter on our history. We need to understand civil rights movement and how the civil rights movement prompted all of this, right? The civil rights, the equal rights, all of this, how people have been indoctrinated to hate the federal government, how people have been indoctrinated to hate the Department of Education, how they've been indoctrinated to hate labor unions, how they've been indoctrinated to want to tear down every institution that protects them, like the Consumer Protection Agency. We have to argue the history of how we got here. And when you can show the Powell Memo and how it specifically outlines this, and you can understand that one piece of history, that will help educate people that aren't so deep in a cult that they can actually still hear the words that are coming out of your mouth. It's up to you and me. So let's do what we can, as small or as big as we can muster up. Because right now, more than ever, this is a battle. It's information versus indoctrination. It's journalism versus propaganda, and it's people versus profit. What side are you going to be on?